So my name's Kathy Looney, and I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the research I've done on the role of simulation in imagery rescripting for post-traumatic stress disorder today, which in a nutshell is just a therapeutic technique within PTSD, and there's a lot of work showing that it's very effective, but there's less work showing how it works or why it works. So that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today. At the end, so I work half-time in Temple Street Children's Hospital as well within the Paediatric Obesity team, so I've recently sort of developed some new research interest in that area. So at the end I just have a slide kind of outlining some of that as well. Please stop me if you have any questions going through it. That's absolutely fine. So just for anyone who is less familiar with the area of PTSD or imagery rescripting, I'm just going to give a bit of a background to that first and the kind of theory behind it. So PTSD is triggered by exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. I'm not going to go through all of the DSM criteria for it, just kind of to give you an outline of it and give you a sense of some of the ones that kind of come into this research. So symptoms include re-experiencing, avoidance, and that's avoidance of things within the environment, triggers, cues, but also people tend to try and avoid particularly strong negative emotions, negative thoughts they have themselves in relation to the traumatic experience. Negative cognitions, low mood, and hyperarousal, which is, I'll get into a little bit more in a moment, that idea of being constantly vigilant for signs of threat or cues for triggers for the trauma. So re-experiencing is often considered sort of the hallmark of PTSD in terms of symptoms. It's usually called flashbacks outside of sort of general terminology. And flashbacks, they're uncontrollable experiences where the person is actually unexpectedly has to relive the worst parts of the trauma without any warning. And they can sort of consist of any types of sensory image of past trauma. So some people will say that it might be a sound or a smell or a taste or like a bodily sensation, but most often people will describe visual images, so they're seeing what happened again. They very much happen, they very much feel as if it's literally happening again. People are re-experiencing these worst parts of this terrible thing that's happened. And the thing about the flashbacks is that the triggers, they are sometimes unconscious awareness. So if you think of a traumatic experience, people will often say that if they go back to the place where it happened, or certain people, especially if it's a perpetrator, that can often act as a trigger for a kind of a re-experiencing or a flashback. But a lot of the triggers, actually people don't know what they are. So they'll be walking down the street and people have said things like, it might take them a really long time to realise. So it might be a soundtrack that was playing in the car before it crashed and you weren't aware of it, but it's in there somewhere and you hear that music and suddenly you re-experience this terrible thing that happened. Or it could be the smell of a perfume, anything like that, and they're not always in conscious awareness. And I suppose if you think back to the other symptoms I was listing, like hyperarousal and avoidance, the kind of flashbacks tend to drive a lot of that, because if you don't know exactly when you're going to experience this horrible thing again, then you're going to try and cover your bases and try and not run into anything that's likely to make that happen. So it really ramps up the kind of hyperarousal, hypervigilance, and that sort of avoidance. So traditionally, there's sort of three dominant theories for PTSD. I'm not going to go into them all in great detail. I've listed the three of them there. They do differ from each other in a lot of ways, but they tend to agree on this idea that traumatic memories are different from other memories in terms of how they're laid down or encoded within our memory system. So there's this sense that due to the sort of heightened sense of arousal that people experience during distress, that the memories are laid down differently and they're sort of disconnected from a sense of time, from a sense of autobiographical memory base, and without the usual sort of retrieval routes in memory. And that's what kind of gives them this here and now sense and this idea that they kind of happen to you without being able to consciously go and sort of remember it, if that makes sense. So they all kind of agree on that general idea that they're laid down differently, and because of that, all of these theories tend to point to what's known as imaginal exposure or reliving, which is the kind of traditional treatment for flashbacks in PTSD, which essentially involves reliving the memory in very great amount of detail, going through every single little bit of what happened, usually multiple times. The idea being that then it can kind of, you're processing it properly, you're putting it back in its place, so to speak, within the memory system. It's very, very complex, and I don't know a huge amount about memory systems, so if you do, I'm sorry if I've sort of made that a bit too brief. But often in therapy, people use this kind of analogy of an airing cupboard or like a hot press, this idea that It's like the trauma memory is laid down like this one. It's like everything's been thrown in, you don't know where anything is, and the kind of doors get slammed shut. Nothing's in its correct place, nothing's where it should be. And there's this idea that if you open the door, or even if you're just walking past the cupboard, sometimes those doors will burst open and everything just kind of hits you in the face. And that's that kind of re-experiencing analogy. And the idea being that within treatment, what you have to do is open the doors, take out everything, look at it, smooth it out, fold it, put it back in its right place, make sure everything is where it's supposed to be, you got your jumpers together, your trousers together, etc. And that idea that once you've done that, then you have control, you know where everything is, you know where everything's supposed to be, and you have control over whether you're going back to that environment. So, there's a lot of research showing that it's been around for a very long time, this treatment, and it's very, very effective. It tends to be less effective for people who experience emotions like guilt, shame, or people who experience dissociation in terms of the trauma memory. So sometimes people might experience a decrease in the frequency of the flashbacks, but this sense of shame or guilt, which is very prevalent for a lot of people with PTSD, doesn't go away. It's not sort of addressed by reliving. And there's also there's a certain amount of research and a lot of anecdotal evidence saying that a lot of people, because it's quite a horrible thing to have to do, to sit down and a number of times go over in great detail one of the worst things that's ever happened to you over and over again. So a lot of people opt not to do it, or they might drop out of treatment partway through. So that, I suppose, is the background to where imagery rescripting comes in. So imagery rescripting was developed as this sort of alternative technique to reliving for it to target intrusive images or flashbacks. And it's similar in that it involves imagining the trauma very, very vividly in the here and now, but it involves, rather than reliving it exactly as it happened, it involves the patient or the client changing the sequence of events in some way. So adding an element of change to the story or the narrative of this traumatic event that happens. And they can basically change it in absolutely any way that they want. So some people will shrink the perpetrator in the narrative, some people will give themselves superpowers to zap people, they'll give themselves super weapons, they'll bring in magical creatures, animals, bears, like anything. They'll bring in superheroes, or they might bring in friends and families to protect them within the image. Sometimes people go back as if it's something that happened to them in childhood, they'll go back as their adult self and sort of be a part of the image and help out their child self in terms of what was happening. So it's this idea that you're altering the image, not the memory, but the image itself in some way, and kind of living that through. In terms of efficacy, there's a lot of work showing that in terms of PTSD, it's been shown to reduce symptoms, and it's also reduced things like anger, shame, guilt, and the dropout rates, which are the things that are not always addressed by some of the more traditional routes. But it's also been shown to be quite effective for intrusive images in social anxiety and depression. So I suppose there's lots of work showing, yeah, it works, it's pretty effective. But there's less work showing why it works or how it works. And I suppose that's quite important, given that it's actually at odds with all of the traditional theories we have of PTSD that suggest that we need to relive everything in absolute great detail in order for the memory to be encoded properly. And this treatment's saying, no, we change the image in some way, and somehow that's effective. From a theoretical point of view, there's been two sort of ideas suggested. One is the retrieval competition, which is basically saying that when we carry out imagery rescripting, it basically creates this second competing, less kind of toxic alternative image. So when we encounter cues, it's that second image that we recall, and that sort of leads to less distress. The other idea is that it actually changes the meaning in some way of the original. So not a second image, not a second idea, but that it changes the meaning that we attach to this sort of initial traumatic event. So that if we do recall it, actually it's not that distressing anymore, because it doesn't have this same horrible kind of meaning attached to it. I suppose the other thing that's not clear, which is where this kind of research focuses, is it's also, so clients themselves will choose different ways to carry out rescripting, but actually therapists carry out rescripting in really different ways as well. So there's huge variations in terms of how much therapists guide people, where they introduce change, and how much of the original trauma image you have to include. Can you just include a tiny bit at the start? Do you have to include loads of it? What access do you have to the kind of original thoughts and emotions versus the new thoughts and emotions, all of this. So there's huge amounts of variation. There's very little work into why is this working or how is this working, or to put it another way, what do therapists need to be doing in the room in order for this thing to be optimal, for it to work to the best of its ability. And there was someone called Caroline Salter who, for her doctorate thesis, developed this session content coding scheme. So she carried out thematic analysis on, something like 40 recordings of trauma imagery rescripting tapes, trying to look at in a bottom-up way what are all of the different factors within imagery rescripting sessions that might link to outcome. And she kind of honed that down over a sort of preliminary kind of case series study to end up with these. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see them there. She has things like the level of therapist guidance. She has things like how vivid is the original imagery, how vivid is the new imagery, how many of the original thoughts and emotions, how many of the new thoughts and emotions, how believable does this rescript feel. And each of these is rated on a scale of 0 to 3, depending on. So the idea is that you would use this coding scheme, listen to the session, and rate the kind of rescript, this narrative on these factors. This coding scheme ended up being used in a number of different small case series designs for various different research questions, various different reasons. And what we did was we tried to find commonalities across all of these cases to see if we could look at these factors a little bit more in an initial sense. So we managed to gather 24 cases, and all of them had one session of rescripting being done that had been coded using this scheme, and the researchers had measured distress before and after. So that was the extent of the commonality we could find for these 24 cases. But that allowed us to, so we checked out the internal consistency for the coding scheme I just showed you. That's probably an overestimation given that it's quite a small sample size, but even if you kind of are a bit more conservative, it's probably in and around 0.7. The idea being that there seems to be this kind of underlying unifying dimension to them, so we can kind of think of them as all having this one sort of underlying dimension of the coding within rescripting. And then what we did was just to see how that links to outcomes. So we measured the change, so we got people's basically change scores. How much did their distress decrease from the start to the end of their rescripting session? And those scores correlated significantly with people's overall coding scheme scores, if that makes sense. So the higher they rated on, wrong way, all the way the wrong way. The higher they rated on all of these things, gave them a sort of a higher overall score, and that linked to the amount of change they experienced. So I suppose it was a good sort of first step in terms of saying the things listed in that framework seem to link to change. But I suppose the two things it doesn't tell us is, one, to what extent do those factors relate to each other? So is it that each of them is completely independently related to outcome, or are there relationships between them? So for example, the idea that we need to think of our original thoughts, processes and emotions and our new thoughts and emotions, is there a balance between that, or is it just that they both need to be really high and that's great? Or for example, we know that people introduce change at different places in the image, and I suppose the idea is are our processes, our thoughts, emotions, etc., independently contributing to change, or does that depend on where we introduce kind of the rescript, if that makes sense? So kind of trying to think about what are the links between some of those things. And the other question, which isn't really addressed by that coding scheme because it's a very sort of bottom-up development of looking at what's readily observable, is this sense that's very important from a theoretical point of view. It's a hypothetical scenario that never happened and could never happen. And why is it that that's affecting change? Because that's kind of the key of rescripting, and it's not really captured within that coding scheme. So that was something we really wanted to look at a bit further, which is where the simulation heuristic enters. So do kind of stop me if you have any questions as I'm kind of going through all of this. But the simulation heuristic basically refers to the process of constructing a mental model of reality in which a hypothetical event takes place, which is just a long-winded way of saying making up a story. And it's based on Kahneman and Tversky's heuristics, but the idea is that you can actually measure the goodness of simulation. So goodness of simulation refers to things like, if you were to make up a story, a hypothetical scenario, and tell it to me right now, I'd be looking out for things like, how does it sort of flow in a logical sense? Does your story make sense logically? Is there a temporal flow in terms of things happening in a good time sequence? Is there an overall sense of flow and coherence? To what extent does your story eliminate any sense of uncertainty, which would suggest that you actually don't know what's going on in your story? And so there's this idea that you can rate these scenarios for their levels of simulation. And the ease of simulation has been linked to subjective probability ratings, or this idea that it feels more believable to people. And there's been really interesting work in other areas. So for example, people with clinical levels of worry, if you ask them to tell you their worries, their hypothetical worries about future events, their worries are simulated to a much higher degree than the worries of the general population, and they feel more believable to them. They feel like, and my worries are going to come true. And I suppose another way of thinking of simulation as we go through this is just to think of it as, how well does this thing flow like a movie? The better it flows like a movie, this imagined scenario, the higher the level of simulation it has. They've also done work they asked a number of women who were pregnant for the first time to simulate or sort of hypothetically imagine the scenario from go into labour to you have the baby in the hospital, and to describe all of the events between those two time points, so people who had never experienced this before. And again, the people who could simulate that to a much higher degree, they believed that was more likely to happen than people whose simulations, their events, their sort of made up events were less like a movie, there was more gaps in them, and they felt like those scenarios were less believable. And again, the people with the higher simulation in that scenario was linked to less worry, because they felt, yeah, that's a really nice ending that's happened there, and that's going to happen, and that's great. So I suppose the thinking here is if simulation, the other thing is just to point out that it's also been suggested that when people simulate the events, that it sort of enhances this ability to interpret past events. If you get them to go through things, it can enhance this ability to kind of alter people's cognitions around it have an effect on their kind of emotional processing of these events. In terms of imagery rescripting, our thinking was the simulation heuristic and imagery rescripting, they both involve making up a hypothetical scenario that either didn't happen or in many cases couldn't have happened at all. So the question was, is imagery rescripting efficacy to some extent based on its level of simulation? So if I'm a therapist, is that something I need to focus on? If I can make my client's rescript be incredibly well simulated, super flowy like a movie, are they going to do better in treatment? Is that one of the kind of mechanisms of change? So that is something that we wanted to look at. We used a single case experimental design and followed 7 participants with post-traumatic stress disorder during imagery rescripting for just one image. So it was just kind of a maximum of 3 sessions. They all were in therapy for varying lengths, but we just honed in on this. You're about to do rescripting of an image, we want to follow you for that. And we recorded all of their sessions. Just a few points about single case design. So generally speaking, it's thought to be very, very useful for looking at things like mechanisms of change, processes at work within therapy, rather than sort of pre-post measures, because we know it works, we don't need to look at that. And when we do pre-post, we kind of have what's happening before, what's happening after, and we're kind of missing the middle part, which is what we want to look at. So the idea behind single case is rather than having say loads and loads of people and looking at a few variables, we don't really know what's going on yet. What we want to do is actually let's look at a few people in great detail with a lot of variables, and that will point us in the direction of links and ideas that we can then use larger end samples to kind of look at a bit more concretely. You need continuous data for each case before, during and after treatment, so you're continuously collecting measures. That's the drill, or type B, one or the other. And you also need a stable baseline. So the idea is that if you can, for example, if you can measure someone's distress and it's going really stable, and you put in an intervention and it suddenly starts going down, that looks great, because you can say, well, I started doing some work there and they got better. It rarely happens like that, but that's kind of the idea. But it's this idea that actually each person can act as their own control group, because their baseline is their control for their own treatment, if that makes sense. Massive debate at the moment in terms of whether people should use purely visual analysis, just looking at the graphs for single case, or whether we should use statistical analysis. For us, that was answered by the amount of data we had. We could do a certain amount of statistical analysis, and then we didn't have enough data to carry out a lot of more kind of sophisticated stats, so that was part of the answering. But also, I have a few of the graphs just to show you what you may or may not miss sometimes by doing it. In terms of measures, we spent a really long time thinking about this, because I suppose, like I said, we're not trying to look at whether it's effective, because we know that. And if you use something like, say, a symptom measure for PTSD, a diagnostic tool, it's not going to change very much for just rescripting of one image among many images, which is only part of a much wider treatment package. If you only followed them for this one image, I wouldn't expect their overall symptomatology to reduce that much. What you want is something that's going to be specific to the thing that you're looking at, and that's going to change over a short period of time and be sort of sensitive to smaller changes. So these are often used again in SCED design or single case design, visual analog scales, basically asking people on a scale of 0 to 100, how distressed are you by this target image we're working on right now? And continuously asking them that. So we use measures like that for distress frequency. We have a lot of them, probably too many more. And then at the same time as collecting all of this continuous data, we had every single session we coded using this goodness of simulation framework. So how well does this thing flow like a movie, which is rated on a scale of 0 to 12. And then we also use that session content coding scheme I was talking about earlier to look at those kind of readily observable characteristics within rescripting. And I suppose our main question is imagery rescripting efficacy dependent, at least in part, on its level of simulation? But with the other coding framework, we also wanted to start to explore to what extent do these things, what kind of patterns can we see within our cases for all of these other codes as well? I won't go into these in huge amount of detail. These are our participants. I suppose that some details are changed, otherwise they might be identifiable. But the point here is that they're they're not a uniform group of people, which is quite good for a study like this because it makes it generalisable. So they're all collected from a trauma service in London. Very different age ranges, ethnicities, very different in terms of the amount of treatment they'd experienced before, comorbidities, etc. Which is why it's so important to just try and hone in on this one image and just the kind of outcome measures associated with this one image. So we looked at people both at a kind of a group level, and the idea behind SCOUT is that you also look at individual cases, patterns within cases, and then whether you can see those patterns across people. But in terms of group level, we use the reliable change index, which is again often used in SCOUT design. This is just a formula to sort of determine whether someone has met criteria for reliable change or not. And in this graph, you can so basically the three triangles up here, they are our low responders. They didn't meet criteria for change. We have 4 people, which are the squares below the red line, who did meet criteria. So those are our high responders in the study. And then the ones who are below both the red line and the blue dash line also met criteria for clinically significant change as well. Okay, so at a group level, can you guys see this? This is sort of an outline of all our participants are listed down here. The line in the middle just separates our high responders from the low responders. The first column is our measure of goodness of simulation, and it's averaged across sessions in this table. And then I've got the coding for each participant. So for participant big D, if you look a lot across, you can see they're coding for each of these individual codes from the coding, one of the coding frameworks. And the shading is just to give a sense of higher versus, so the darker the colour, the higher the coding, to just sort of have a sort of a visual representation for it. I suppose in simulation, the first thing, that was kind of, in terms of our statistical analysis at group level, that was as far as we could go. After this, we didn't have enough data or enough participants to start doing further statistical analysis, so it is observational or descriptive, I suppose, from here on in. But what is interesting is all of the high responders experienced high levels of simulation, or not experienced, but their rescripts were all very highly simulated. They really did flow quite well like a movie. Whereas our lower responders below the line tended to have medium or lower levels of simulation within their rescripts. And apart from the top 2 participants, it almost kind of goes in a stepward way. So the lowest responder had the lowest level of simulation, and the next one had the next level of simulation, apart from the top 2. Which I suppose again is the idea that that's good sort of preliminary evidence that simulation does seem to be playing a role here. The idea that if your rescript is better simulated, those people did seem to experience more change. I should have said that the way we distinguish between high and low responders, the outcome measure was a combination of distress and frequency, because that's often cited within the literature and the big sort of measures of PTSD in terms of symptomatology. So we use this kind of distress frequency combination for people in relation to this target image. So that's the kind of simulation side of it. If you then look, I'm not going to go into every single one of the codes, I'll summarise them towards the end, but the clearest differences can be seen for things like, if you look at the new processes, basically the 3 last rows. So the high responders tended to have very high levels of thoughts, emotions, physical sensations associated with the new rescripted elements of their imagery relative to the lower responders. They also tended to experience higher levels of cognitive emotional shift from their rescripting, and also there was this sense of felt believability. The rescript felt believable to them, even though it might have a magical creature or Superman or whoever in the rescript. So those were some of the strongest kind of differences between the high and low responders. and therapist guidance, sorry, that was the other one. And the therapist guidance is a reverse rated code, so what that's kind of showing is lower levels of therapist guidance or independent rescripting tended to be optimal. There was kind of medium differences seen for things like the timing of change. So for example, that's the idea that basically people who, all of the high responders tended to introduce change during some of the worst moments of their image. Whereas the low responders, 2 out of the 3 of them, introduced change much earlier on, so they completely avoided the kind of worst moment and introduced change before that. I suppose what I find sort of interesting about looking at some of these, which is kind of the nice thing about SCED and looking at patterns and within things, is if you look at something like the original processes here, the mean difference between the high and low responders was negligible. There's very little difference on a kind of a mean score level between their thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc., associated with their original imagery. But what's interesting is if you look at the patterns, the high responders tended to be in the kind of middle ranges. So they were accessing their original thoughts, feelings, etc., to a pretty high level, but not super high and not absent. And the other thing is that they tended to access them to a lower level than the new thoughts, new emotions, new sensations associated with the rescripted part. Whereas if you look at the low responders, while the mean was quite similar, they tend to be either very high or very low on their kind of original thoughts, etc. So they were either accessing them a lot or actually not accessing them at all. And they don't have that same pattern of, it them being sort of a step below their kind of new, less sort of distressing imagery. So I suppose that those are the kind of things, again, this is where the arguments come in as to whether we should just use statistical analysis or not, and whether it should be based on a more kind of visual sense. So part of what this work involved, which I definitely don't have time to go into all of them, is looking at each person and all of their individual measures and looking at patterns and then looking at every single participant, looking at each person individually and then looking at patterns across them. But I suppose I wanted to just include a few of the graphs just to give a sense of what some of the SCED data looks like, and also to have a think about the many difficulties that come with this type of research. This is one of our high responders. I picked this one because she was one of the most variable in terms of the data, sometimes it was difficult to sort of tell what was going on. You can see that within it. So the black dots are the actual data points, the actual levels of whether it's frequency or distress or whatever it is. The dashed line is the measure of central tendency from each phase, and the dotted lines where they exist are the trend lines. And so you've got your kind of baseline phase, your treatment phase, and your follow-up phase. And so I suppose if you look, so frequency and distress would have been combined to decide whether this person was a high or low responder. And they just look quite different from each other. So for example, the frequency has a really nice stable baseline, which is great. There's not a huge change in terms of the central tendency, but if you look at the trend, it goes up at the start of treatment and then it just comes down all the way. So it just keeps coming down, which is a pretty good indication of, that seems to be that frequency is coming down, it's not going anywhere else. If you look at the distress, if you only look at the measure of central tendency, it looks great. It looks like this really nice jump from baseline to treatment, and that's maintained at follow-up. And I suppose if you think of a pre-post measure, you wouldn't have this at all. This part wouldn't exist. That whole phase, you would just have maybe this line and that would look fantastic. But actually, there's a load of variability within there, and they jump straight back up again at the start of their follow-up phase, which isn't fantastic. The other thing that can be said, though, is at no point did they experience distress to the same level as baseline once treatment started. And there is a kind of, you can sort of see an oscillating, it is going up and down, but apart from this one here, it almost looks like the oscillation is slowly kind of tapering off. But these are the kind of things, these are the difficulties that come in with visual analysis. Do we count that as reliable change? Some people would actually say no, some people would say yes. This is another of our high responders, different difficulty with this one, so no sort of variability. And if you look at the treatment phases for frequency and interference, that's interference with everyday life. Sorry, but online it's actually minus that we're looking at. If you just look at the treatment phase, that's really nice coming all the way down, but that it's very similar to the baseline phase. You've already got a sort of a downward trend for that. We did have a statistical way of testing for baseline stability, and this is where the kind of the debate comes in. So both of those baselines met criteria for stability. So the stat said, yeah, those are stable baselines, that's fine. You can consider any change after that, we're looking at it the way, and you can consider any change after that to be attributed to the treatment. But to my eye, that doesn't look right. For that one, that just looks like a perfect slope all the way down. There are ways of looking at it statistically if you have enough data points, which we just about did for this participant. So there's called the tau U analysis, and it's basically a way of looking at data overlap between one phase and the next and controlling for baseline stability. When we did that for this person, this was significant, so this counted as change, but that one didn't. That just was too much all the same, if that makes sense. But these are the kind of things that we are going through when we look at each participant in turn, and I just sort of wanted to give a bit of a sense of that. The other thing is when you look at coding across sessions, it's not uniform. So what I showed you in that first giant sort of table was the averages across sessions. But you can see for this person, their simulation increased across sessions. So they started off with a less simulated rescript, and by the end it had gotten much higher. They also changed in terms of therapist guidance, and a lot of our high responders did that. If you just look at group level, it looks like independent rescripting is the way to go. But if you look at the patterns across a lot of the cases who were high responders, they started out with more therapist guidance, and slowly over the sessions, they sort of tapered into doing it a bit more independently. And again, those things linked to things like increases in mood process, increases in cognitive emotional shift, and the sort of rescript believability. Just to also show you a low responder and what some of their graphs look like. The low responders didn't necessarily not change at all, it's just that the level of change wasn't high enough for them to be considered sort of reliably changed. So you can see central tendency going down, especially that first one. That's a nice, reliable, well, it's not reliable clinically, but you can see that shift down, and it is a nice sort of change down, but it's not a very big one. And then for that graph there, for example, that's a useless graph in a way. You can't tell anything from that because the baseline is so unstable that I have no idea. I can't attribute anything to the onset of treatment here because it's essentially the same as it was. We had this one participant, and I was looking at all their graphs, and for every graph, the first two data points were beautifully stable, and then there was this huge drop that sort of then matched their treatment level. And she said in one of her sessions, she's like, "Hey, you told me about rescripting the week before we started, so I started doing it spontaneously at home." So she was actually spontaneously rescripting and practicing her own image, which was matched perfectly by the graph, but killed our data, which is not what you think. It's sort of half as a therapist, half as a researcher. You're like, that's great that you felt better sooner, but now we have no baseline because you need at least 3 baseline points for it to be considered stable, and 2 was no good. So again, within SCED, you're kind of looking at the kind of qualitative data you get from people as well. What are the explaining factors we have behind some of these things? And again, that variable graph I showed you earlier, the first participant, she had a lot of other things going on in her life as those weeks went on, which might also account for that kind of up-down sense of how much the PTSD was affecting her. In a nutshell, to kind of summarise, I suppose, that side of things, what that sort of work seems to show is, and what I'm doing here is summarising the findings from this, but also summarising perhaps some of the hypothetical links based on other research or other theories. So what seems to be most effective in terms of rescripting is that people include some of the original, but mostly new imagery. Okay, so they do have some of the kind of original traumatic part, but mostly new, that it has to coincide in time with the kind of trauma, with the worst part of it, with the actual trauma event itself. You can't start introducing change before the trauma actually starts happening. And then what seems to be is if you facilitate a highly simulated rescript, that seems to be really effective. The reason those bits are in grey, so original new processes, rescript believability, and cognitive emotional shift, this study has shown that those things seem to be important. What's not clear from this, but what might be partially suggested a little bit by this, but also by a lot of previous research done in these areas, is that it's possible that by facilitating a highly simulated rescript, you might automatically the people might automatically be accessing the original thoughts and processes, the new thoughts and processes. And all of those things together may automatically facilitate this shift in believability and this cognitive emotional shift. So that kind of needs to be studied further, but like I said, with the research in other areas, we know that simulation links to believability. So it may be that just by facilitating the level of simulation, we might already impact that believability. And the other thing is this idea of therapist guidance moving towards independent across sessions. Really quickly, to just add the next kind of part of this was looking at counterfactual thinking within PTSD, which links in. So counterfactual thinking is is basically imagining alternative realities in reference to past events. So we all do it all the time if we have a bad experience or an embarrassing experience, and we think, what if I hadn't said that, if only I had done that differently, whatever it is. It usually happens after bad events, and it tends to be upward in nature. So we rarely say, well, at least it wasn't worse. At least I didn't say something even stupider. Okay, we usually kind of get at the bits we wanted to change. And it tends to, when it's self-afferent, so self-afferent is when it's about me. So I might, so after today I might say, a self-afferent upward counterfactual thought is me saying, I wish I hadn't included that slide, that's my fault, I did it, and it was bad, and it could have been better. And you could have an other referent, which is, I wish Paul or Helen had been a better audience, and they should have been better, and then the whole thing would have been better, okay? And we tend to do this all the time, and there's this sort of functional theory that's saying that actually it could be beneficial. So I might feel guilt or shame or self-blame or regret or any of these things later on today, but the idea is that I might learn something from it. So I might spend a day or two being like, oh, I only done that better if I prepared better, whatever it is. But the idea is I might learn, okay, well next time I need to prepare better, or I need to put in more slides or less slides or whatever it is, and the next time I do this talk, it'll be better. And then the counterfactual thinking tends to go down, it tends to subside. And that's what happens within the non-clinical population. And thinking is, it might feel horrible while you're doing it, but there's a benefit to it. Within PTSD, it's very common for people to engage in counterfactual thinking. It always tends to be, like I said, upward in nature, self-afferent, and it links to a lot of distress and a lot of decreased well-being. Unlike the non-clinical population, where I might get over it in a few days, it tends to keep going, it tends to be sustained. And the thinking is that they sort of think that it might be that in order for it to be considered adaptive and for it to go away, that we need to know that the event is highly likely to occur again, and that the better scenario is attainable. So I might go back to my office after this and think, well, I definitely am going to have to present on this again at some point. And so that's a likely thing to happen again. And also, is a better scenario attainable? Yeah, it's pretty easy for me to get better at something or to add a few bits and pieces or to take it away. Whereas if you consider a traumatic event, it doesn't have that same sense of it happens all the time, or that sense of what I could have done differently. How attainable are those things? So that's the thinking behind why it keeps going. The reason it got included in this sort of study, in this line of thinking, is because, again, counterfactual thinking is very, very like imagery rescripting, except that it's thought-based rather than image-based. It's people thinking about ways that the thing could have turned out differently. If only I hadn't gone down that street, if only that hadn't happened. But in a way that somehow is increasing or prolonging distress. Imagery rescripting, very similar as a concept, but it decreases distress. And that led us to this question of, is imagery rescripting somehow rechanneling our counterfactual thinking such that it becomes adaptive and actually it sort of subsides? Is that again one of the mechanisms of change within imagery rescripting? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we had very, very, very little evidence for this. I would not even consider this evidence. What I consider this to be is a very, very small amount of data that points in the direction of some interesting work yet to do. But we measured counterfactual thinking at two levels. So we gave people and it wasn't actually rated on 0 to 16, that's a lie, I think it was 0 to 4. But we gave people a subscale from this measure that asked them about their self-afferent upward counterfactual thinking in relation to the negative event. So it was a questionnaire study. And then we also asked people, when you think about this traumatic image, what are the three main ways you tend to counterfactualize about it? What are the things you're always thinking about, you wish it could have been different, if only this, if only that? We asked them to write them down, and we asked them to, again, measure the distress and frequency if there was a stigma along. So, like I said, very, very small amount of data. But I suppose what was interesting was, so here are participants again, here are high responders and the low responders. We only had 5 people who filled out these measures. But all the high responders saw a decrease in their counterfactual thinking, and 2 of them actually found, those are the ones in bold, are significant reductions in counterfactual thinking based on the same study, so this rescripting of 1 image. And all of the high responders either stayed the same or their counterfactual thinking got worse. So it's very, very small amount of data, but I think it points to something that could possibly also be going on, and it's something I really want to look at further, do a kind of proper study on this. At an individual level, the data was very, very messy for this. But what was interesting was all participants chose spontaneously to rescript in line with at least one of their counterfactual thoughts. So we didn't ask them to, but they actually spontaneously, when they were in sessions, would pick some of their counterfactuals as their basis for the story of what happened. What was also interesting was that only 50% of their counterfactual thought were self-referent, which is not really in line with the literature at all. So 50% of them were other-referent. If only that person had actually been there to help me, if only the police had responded in more times, it came up a few times as well. So this idea of maybe it's not always self-referent, and that there might be other-referent. And we were asking them to pick their main ones, the ones they think about the most often. When you look at the sort of SCED graphs for these, it was very, very messy. But what was interesting was that what you found for some of the participants was that the distress level of their counterfactual thought would be quite stable across sessions, and then the session which they chose to rescript in line with their counterfactual thought, you'd see this sudden drop in distress for that thought, and sometimes for the other ones as well. It wasn't consistent, and it was messy because we weren't making them, they could change it the next week and rescript it in a different way, so it was quite hard to track. But again, so I'm not seeing this as sort of any result of any kind, but it's just this interesting idea of what happens if we use that as the basis for our rescripting. Does that lead to better outcomes? It might, and it might be a really good way to start with kind of think about actually, how do you already imagine this to be different? Because sometimes therapists will suggest the way for the rescript to go. But there's sort of this preliminary suggestion that actually maybe the ideas are there within the way they already wish it could be different, and maybe if they live that through in an imaginal-based way, image-based way, that somehow has this knock-on effect in terms of the distress of the image, but also the distress related to this counterfactual processing. That's the summary of that side of things. So I suppose it's preliminary findings suggesting that simulation seems to be playing a role here, not just in terms of reducing the stress of the trauma image, but also reducing possible distress frequency associated with the counterfactual thinking, which we know to be part of PTSD. And I suppose there's sort of pointers for where we need to look next in terms of how these factors link together, and perhaps carrying out larger scale studies on some of that work. Really quickly to finish off, completely different area, but I suppose, as I said at the start, I also work half-time in the Paediatric Obesity team in Temple Street Hospital. And so I suppose another area that I'm really getting into at the moment is stigma within this population. So there's a huge body of research documenting stigma towards kids with obesity, but it tends to be measuring stigma in other people. So the way that we all might be prejudiced towards people with overweight, and children might be, in health professionals and teachers, and there's lots of research showing that basically across all areas of society, people hold a lot of stigma towards kids and young people with overweight difficulties or with obesity. There's also a lot of studies showing that young people with obesity have lower self-esteem, they're more likely to suffer from low mood, they're less likely to go on dates, less likely to have romantic relationships. What's less sort of investigated is how the stigma is actually experienced by the young people themselves. So what is their experience of all the stigma coming at them from all different directions in society? To what extent is that impacting on treatment and on everything else that we know is already going on for them? And there's been, I suppose, interesting sort of work or ideas that looks at, so for example, if you think of stigma can be linked to increased stress. And we know that stress has potential to increase things like blood pressure, cortisol levels, hypertension, which are all things that kids with obesity are already struggling with. So they already have those health difficulties. So not only is stigma likely to impact on mental health, but actually probably furthering, compounding the physical health difficulties that they already have. And so that's kind of something that I'm starting to look into more now. And I suppose we run an intervention at Temple Street, and primarily the targets are around things like increasing things to do with healthy living, so increasing physical activity, healthy eating, sleep, less screen time, that kind of thing. We would like to think that our intervention is also decreasing stigma to some extent, well, and that might not be one of our absolute primary aims. And that's kind of something I'd like to start working towards, looking at that. Is it reducing stigma? And if it isn't, we need to do something about it and change it. Because I suppose from an anecdotal point of view as a therapist, I'm always shocked by the things that the kids tell me when they come in, the things that other people feel that they can say to them, and we often, in assessment, ask questions around, I ask a simple question, like if you were to rate your mood generally, where would you rate it? What makes it higher? What makes it lower? And when you ask them what makes your mood lower, and things that just automatically pop out are things like looking in the mirror. And I had a 12-year-old last week saying anything that makes me think about me. And that can be the mirror, it can be going shopping with people, it can be even people just asking her about herself, and the automatic thing she goes to is the fact that she feels that she's overweight and that does something bad about it. So that's kind of, I suppose I have yeah, a couple of reasons to be interested in it, but that's kind of another area that I'm getting into. I feel like I should stop talking. So if anyone has any questions about any of those areas, I'm happy to comment or anything.
Dr Kathy, about the earlier stuff, I might be wrong, so it might be a two-parter depending on how you answer the first part. Am I right in thinking that there's a cognitive task in generating a simulation, and then there's the cognitive effort around regulating your response towards that simulation, and that if asking a client to imagine something and be okay with it, or start to gain the skills to regulate their own emotions, that there might be something to separate out those tasks. And that was to lead on to the idea, if I'm right in thinking that way, the idea that different people might have stronger skills in different areas. So the person who's just really good at visualizing things and manipulating these simulations may be better able to kind of focus on their responses towards that experience. Because that links more broadly to ideas around the function of fiction and engagement with stories in general, and the individual differences that might make people more vulnerable or not.
Yeah, so
maybe the fundamentals of that I'm getting wrong, I guess.
So I'm not sure if I completely understand, but I suppose I'll say things and see if you answer the
yes, that's all.
But I suppose in terms of therapy, so I was the one coding lead, so I was listening to the therapy session. So it's not necessarily people are explicitly asked to do all of these different things, but what they do, so it starts with a kind of a general conversation. You can look, we talked about this image, this is when we're going to start with, how, like on a sort of almost like a planning level, how do you want to change it, how could we change it? And then once they get that, they go into this whole, okay, from the start, walking through it, you're in the here and now, what can you see, what can you hear, what's so-and-so saying, what are you feeling right now? And the therapist will be walking through them. So I suppose their ability, depending on their levels of ability, some people are amazing at imagining stuff like this, and some people not so much, which I think is also where the guidance comes in. From listening to them, once the guidance goes in there, people generally can start to do it, and that's where it might taper off. They're not necessarily explicitly asked always about what that does to everything else at a cognitive process. But there was one thing suggesting that maybe there's something about it that, again, linking to the kind of counterfactual idea, if you actually get someone to live out this counterfactual, live it out in the best thing you can get to actually doing it, imagining it in super great detail, maybe there's some sort of click moment or where they realise, I'm saying if only this didn't happen. But actually when I live through the whole thing step by step, it's not just this tiny, well, if only this one tiny thing hadn't happened. Actually there's a huge disparity between what I'm if onlying and the thing that actually happened. And so therefore, is it all guilt, shame, me, or is it a horrible thing that happened, and it sort of shifts, not necessarily someone saying it, you know, this kind of by the process of doing it, people will shift a little bit in terms of actually it feels believable in one sense, but actually the extent to which that's different from what actually happened is phenomenal. And if that's what it took for this thing to turn out differently, it's not my fault. I don't know if that answers anything.
No, I think actually hearing you talk means maybe I'm wrong with the fact that they're separate tasks in the first place. Yeah, I'd like to chat to you more about it.
It sounds like, though, as with any therapy, a person's ability to have an observer of some kind, a head of the part is able to look in on themselves. You're saying that people that are too in it, too flooded maybe, it's too strong or too cut off, the results are less, you know, it seems. So it's this middle, just the right kind of, you know, ability, that meta piece, even whether it's conscious or unconscious or something, but just that little distance from
and again,
what's going on.
I suppose that's what the aim is aiming towards, is giving therapists who work within trauma a sense of, because you could also say, based on the fact that reliving is super effective, maybe you do need to go in, all guns in, and do the whole thing. But I suppose what this is suggesting, that maybe the therapist needs to taper it a little bit, and because you'll hear it when you listen to these tapes and things, you hear the therapist like interrupting, going through, okay, what are you feeling now? Where are you feeling that? How are you feeling that? And maybe it's from a therapist's point of view, doing that more in the second half, doing it in the first half, but being the one to taper the extent to which they're completely immersed in the all of those original processes, and making sure it kind of gets ramped up a little bit in the descriptive part.
Have there ever been linked to physiological arousal? It's like, you know, you're talking about being hooked up to watching a film there this morning, whatever, but you know, that the point at which, like, is there some information there that is, again, not an awareness, but the body, something happens at that point, you're saying, this is just right.
Yeah.
And it could just point where the therapist comes in and says, right, you know, and let's you hit it.
Use that kind of.
There's a machine or something to tell you you've hit it.
That's a really good question. I mean, they've definitely done things like that within PTSD and a lot of, obviously, sort of clinical research. I don't know if they've done it specifically with rescripting.
It's just that so much of this is kind of, it's pushing it out of awareness, isn't it? It's kind of
Yes.
saying it's really interesting here that memories are coded differently, so it's not in that conscious awareness to the same sense. So equally the body has such a level of information which we didn't either.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't even write anything actually in terms of whether they measured that in sessions during, I suspect not, because some of this, after the kind of efficacy levels, the internal what's going on, how's it working, is still quite in its infancy, so possibly not.
Thanks, Kathy. These items, the goodness of simulation items, are they, what's the nature of those items? I don't know if you presented the slides, or maybe and in particular, are they about how much people elaborate on the simulation, or more about how plausible the simulation is?
So the goodness of simulation is another coding scheme, basically, and it has factors in it like, so it's overall rate out of 12, but there was factors, 5 or 6 4 or 5 factors within that, and each of those was coded on a mini scale, if that makes sense. So one thing you'll be rating is how well is this rescript sequenced in terms of its timing. So does it suddenly jump, you know, am I sort of in this room and then suddenly I'm down the road and I don't know how I've gotten or how the person has gotten from there to there. So you'd be rating it in terms of its time sequencing. Another is a logical sequencing, logical within the world of the rescript. So you can have magical, fantastical creatures, but it has to logically make sense. So you can create a magical thing that zaps in whatever creature I want, and then I get on the back of that creature and I fly up to the roof. That's fine, if that makes sense. But does it logically follow its own sort of trajectory? Another one is minimizing uncertainty. So were there elements that I'm super uncertain about? So there were all of these things, each of them rated on I can't remember the exact rating for each one, but again, it had the alpha rating was very high for that. So there was an underlying sort of construct for all of them, so we could get a kind of a total. So each person's rescript was rated on these individual facets of goodness of simulation to give this overall range. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it probably would act as a measure of how elaborate the simulation was.
Yeah, so one of them was to do with that kind of level of detail. How detailed is it versus not. The kind of best way of thinking of it is if this person is described, I mean not the best way for using the coding scheme, because they're very, very also at each level. So if you're rating something on a scale of 0, 1 or 2, for each one of those there are anchor points. This is a 2, this is a 1, this is a 0. Same for the other coding scheme. There were very specific anchoring points so that it was kind of consistent. But overall, in terms of thinking about simulation, is how well is it? Does it look like a movie? If you were talking about this, could I see this projected up onto the screen as a movie, or do I have no idea what the thing looks like? Do I have no idea where it's going? Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And the reason I was asking that is I wondered how much it's about how they're creating meaning out of the situation, or how much it's about ease of retrieval, like you said. It could be that as you elaborate on it more, create more meaning.
So that's almost like, so that's the two competing theories. Is it creating a second image, or is it changing the meaning of the first image? And that side of the literature kind of drives me up the wall, because there are studies looking at that, but to my mind, most of the evidence could be pitched either way. I think it's very hard to get at that idea, and I do call it.
The gene process stuff might help. Kind of, it's a movement from one to the other. Might be a way that they're not competing, but that it's about this is more scaffolded, and then eventually it'll be more automatic. It'd be really cool to look at that sort of stuff.
Yeah, because that's the part that seems to be harder to gauge. So this side of actually, on a basic in the room level, what do we do? But then that thing of what's it doing? Is it a new competing thing, or how do you just change the meaning so it no longer means I'm a failure or I'm worthless to actually I'm okay, not as horrible. And a lot of the evidence for those things can be pitched both ways. It's hard to get it.
You could probably make meaning out of the situation without having to relive it. So
Yeah.
because I guess to some people that just doesn't work at all. I imagine. Anyway.
Yeah, people who do traditional reliving also often have a change in sort of that sense of we often call it encapsulated belief in therapy. What's the same about you and the world? And so not just rescripting, but people who do traditional therapy for PTSD do still experience that sort of shift. And again, we'll be prompted to do so by therapists. What does that mean about this? What does it say?
I think there is a view within therapy recently that it's not about going in and sitting in the mess all the time. It's actually, as the person's talking, it's regulating each time and soothing. That's what's actually making a difference. So you don't have to go into all of the stories all the time. It's again the person and their physiological, the regulation that is filtering down all the time and changing something.
Yeah, and it's fun. I don't know. I find it fascinating to listen to. I don't work with trauma, and that sort of, it's such an interesting form of therapy, and you can hear the difference between when they're talking about the horrible thing that happened, and then this rescript and these amazing ideas about it. Yeah, I don't know. It's just very interesting to listen to. I realise that the training has been working, so I think we wrap up. But thank you all.
Thank you.